Good day, everyone. This has been an interview that has been a long time in the making. If you're a member of our vivabarneslaw.locals.com community, there's been a member of our community, Tzvi Hansis, who has been asking for this interview for a very long time. And it sort of follows an interview I did with Scott Horton back in the day. It certainly fits within contemporaneous discussion right now. Dave Smith, Douglas Murray having added on Joe Rogan. We've got a scholar, historian, Gadi Taub, who, if you don't know who he is, you will certainly know who he is after this. I was going to read his bio, but I always prefer to let the guest actually give their own bio so that I don't screw anything up, that I don't undersell them. And we're going to talk about the Middle East, Israel, broader geopolitical conflicts, and some questions that I've had for over a year now since the October 7 terrorist attacks and the ensuing fallout, political fallout throughout the world. Without further ado, we're going to bring in Gadi Taub. And
hello.
Gadi, thank you for coming on. And we are many thousands of kilometers away, so I'm going to make sure to let the delay between which we end a sentence and start go, so that this doesn't get to what's the Stooges type comedy. Gadi, your resume is actually quite impressive, and I didn't want to undersell you. Could you explain to the world who you are, just the brief overview of your academics, your professional experience before we get into childhood and then into modern politics?
Who I am has been a difficult question for me always. I was born in Jerusalem. My professional training is actually American history. I have a PhD in American history. I'm a novelist. I wrote a few drama series. What's the plural of series? It's also series, right?
Yep.
So I wrote a few of these, and I have a podcast which is actually the #1 conservative podcast in Israel, and that was recently confirmed because the one place where the Prime Minister gave his full account of his perspective on the war was on my podcast called Gatekeeper. So I've been here since Corona with a shoddy mic and a little camera, and now we podcasters are just completely changing the media landscape in Israel too.
So you're born in Jerusalem, 1964, if I'm not mistaken. 1965. Your parents came to Israel when? They were there pre-1948 establishment of the State of Israel.
Yeah, I actually come from the heart of the establishment. My mother is a daughter of pioneers, actual pioneers, who founded a kibbutz in the Valley of Israel. It's a famous kibbutz. If you know Israel well, so it's Mishmar HaEmek. It's now a very well-established kibbutz. So she comes from there. It's the radical side of the left. It's I wouldn't say it's a communist, but verging on. This is left of Mapai, left of the Ben Gurion party. And my father was a refugee from Czechoslovakia, not a Holocaust survivor, by the way, a refugee. He left Bratislava in June 1939. That's 3 months after the German invasion. That's long before the Holocaust. His mother had died from cancer. And he convinced his father, he was a very politically aware boy, and he convinced his father to leave Czechoslovakia because he said it will not end well. Nobody knew the Holocaust was coming, of course. And he remembers the Wehrmacht soldiers knocking on their door and asking for water for their pots because they were cooking pasta outside where they lived. And that boy who read newspapers in 4 languages, this is Middle Europe, this is the old Habsburg Empire territory. And he convinced his father, and they set sailing, first on a steamship down the Danube, and then on a refugee ship called the Nome Julia, who my father referred to as a bathtub with 400 people. And no country in the world would let them ashore. And for 4 months they were at sea. So you could say I'm an instinctive Zionist, because although I teach courses on the history of Zionist thought and so forth, Zionist history, the Israeli politics and society, and I tell my students in the end, I know the full justifications for the right of the Jews to self-determination, but all justifications aside, my father was a Jewish boy with only seawater under his feet for 4 months, and he could have been swallowed by the Nazi monster had they not landed in the end on the shores of Israel and were arrested by the Brits, where my grandfather volunteered to be a cook on His Majesty's army and left my father here in a foster family.
I have so many questions. I'll just start with the most obvious.
I may just want to add that my father became, I would say, with his own 10 fingers, but there were only 6. He lost half his hand in the War of Independence, but he became a very prominent economist. Until Likud came to power, he was a Mapai guy of the left, and he was the Secretary General of the Bank of Israel and then the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And then Likud came to power, and he took a much lower job because he refused to go to the private sector. We could have been very rich after you're the head of the Securities and Exchange Commission. And he said, I came here to found a Jewish society, not to become rich. And he stayed in a civil service job that was way below his grade as the CEO of the single Hebrew public publishing house. But there are not enough Hebrew readers, for a scientific translation of Kant. So it's financed publicly, and my father was a CEO of that company.
Okay, so it's fascinating. He's leaving Czechoslovakia 39 pre-Holocaust, or as things are starting to, get serious. Why are no other countries taking Jews, or are they not taking any immigrants, or Jewish immigrants in particular, or Jewish illegal aliens?
Not go anywhere. Not Churchill's Britain, not Roosevelt's USA, not anywhere in Europe, certainly not Arab countries in the Middle East and North Africa. They had nowhere to go, literally nowhere to go. I don't know what would have happened if they could have sailed to Brazil, but they couldn't do that. And in their range, there was nobody who would take Jewish refugees from Europe at that point.
What was the historical justification at the time, or the rationale at the time? For not taking Jewish immigrants?
Nobody cared, I think, enough, and resources were stretched, and people didn't want to open the floodgates for a huge number of refugees at that point. Since 1933, when the Nazis came to power, Jews in Europe and especially in Germany suddenly realized that they might be trapped in Europe and began to flee. And so it didn't take long before the gates of immigration were shut around the world before Jewish immigrants.
This is the number one question which people throw around the term online, either as an affirmation or as an insult or an accusation: Zionist, Zionism. Is there an academically accepted definition? And if there's not, what is your understanding definition of the term Zionist/Zionism?
It's a good question for me, because I wrote a book called What is Zionism? And that is after I realized that Hebrew teachers of history in our schools don't exactly know how to explain the logic of the Zionist idea. And it's actually very simple. It's the right of self-determination applied to the Jewish people. So people like Herzl, the founder of Zionism as a political movement, were basically Wilsonians in that they believe that there is a universal right for all peoples to self-determination. So our Declaration of Independence, we are an immigrant society like the United States. So like immigrant societies, we have a proclamation that explains who we are, what it is that you're joining if you're becoming a Zionist and a citizen of the Jewish state. And in that scroll that we have, the Declaration of Independence, there is a line in the middle separating the discussion of the past from the discussion of the future. And that line is the center of the document. And therein it says, it is the natural right of the Jewish people to be like all peoples, masters of their own fate in their own sovereign state. So the creed of democratic self-determination is the heart of Zionism, and it's anchored in the right that we consider universal of all peoples to self-determination, which is why for a long time I supported Palestinian self-determination, until I realized that it was not about self-determination, but about exterminating Jews.
Well, that's the question we're going to get to, and I wonder if it was that pre Yasser Arafat saying we'll accept a two-state solution if you give us the right of return for 6 million Palestinians, or was it earlier than that?
I supported it earlier than that. I did not think it was possible because they said they refused to acknowledge our right to exist, which they still refuse to do. Because if you listen to what Palestinians state, they never say 2 states for 2 peoples. They always say 2 states living side by side in peace, by which they mean that there will be one Palestinian state where Jews would be transferred out, expelled, and another state to which Palestinian refugees would return. So there would basically be 2 Arab majority states, and we know what happens to minority in Muslim Arab majority states, especially the Palestinians who built their national identity around a cult of death. And we saw on October 7th what they are capable of. So I come from the left. I as a child, I was in Peace Now demonstrations. Actually, Peace Now was sort of established in our living room, sort of, not only, there are other living rooms, but these were the sons and daughters of my parents, people a little older than my parents, people who were soldiers in 73, who were my heroes as a child. I was an 8-year-old at the time, but this was an earth-shaking war, the War of Yom Kippur. And the people who returned from the Yom Kippur War were the generation that believed that peace was attainable. And I can't blame them, because we had peace with our most dangerous foe at the time, which was Egypt. And so rather early on, I hoped for a 2-state solution. And I only grudgingly and painfully realized that there is no such solution. That's complete fantasy.
And just to put a bow in the definition of Zionism, self-determination for a Jewish state and the Jewish people within the historical boundaries of Israel, right? Not yes. On the island of Madagascar, yes. For example.
Yes, there was actually it's both a phase and a sub ideology in Zionism called territorialism, which said that the basic principle of Zionism is Jewish self-determination, and therefore any territory where the Jews are a majority would suffice. And there are, I believe, 36 suggestions of where the Jewish state could be. My favorite is actually Montana. I've been to Montana twice. Not many people have been to Montana twice.
I haven't been there, but
Montana have not always been in Montana twice.
It's a beautiful state.
It's beautiful, and it would be hard to pick a fight with Wisconsin, wouldn't it? So it's a bit cold for me. I don't like the cold. But very quickly, the Zionist leaders realized that if Zionism was about preserving Jewish identity, then preserving Jewish identity, as we now say, is preserving the historical narrative of the Jews, which is the story of the Exodus of Egypt. But the story is not only about where we came from, slavery in Egypt. It is also about where we went, and that is our homeland. So self-determination is tied to a homeland, as it is for almost all peoples. Roma may be the one outstanding exception, but you can't think of British patriotism, British self-determination if it's not in Britain, because then when you try, you suddenly get a rebellion and the colonies become the United States.
Now, the issue with Zionism is that your grandfather landed in Israel. It was pre-48, so it still wasn't officially the state of Israel. And the argument goes that Palestinians were there first, although it was a British, what's the word? Not a satellite, a British mandate. Sorry, British satellite. The argument was that it was never the Palestinians in the first place for them to lay claim to it. The flip side argument to that is Jews and Palestinians lived there, coexisted pretty peacefully, even as of the late 1800s, when the Zionist movement started gaining traction. And then it only became an issue when it became formally an independent state, or when Britain gave it over to the Jews or gave it over to Israel.
Yeah. Well, there were very few Arabs in the land of Israel, They did not think of themselves as Palestinians, nor did we, nor any other Arabs. We thought there are many Arab countries. There would be an Arab minority in the state of the Jews too. But once Zionism started developing the country, it also became a magnet for Arabs from neighboring countries. And the Arab population grew along with the Jewish population, though not always at the same pace. There was, however, a brewing problem, as everyone understood, at least since the Arab rebellion of 36, a rebellion against the British mandate, which was eventually a failure. But what the international community, and especially the UNSCOP Commission, the Commission on Palestine, that the UN appointed, was a plan that said, look, there are two peoples here. They both claim that this is their homeland. The problem between them is preserving the national self-determination of each. So let's divide the country into two, according to demography, where the populations are. And this was the plan that the Zionist movement accepted and the Arabs rejected. So once the Brits said they're leaving the country, the Arabs embarked, 5 armies invaded the land of Israel, embarking on a war of declared genocide to annihilate the Jewish people. That was the end of the war, and we defeated them and conquered some of the territory that was supposed to be for the Arab state. Nobody said Palestinian, mind you, not even a Palestinian. Everybody said an Arab country. And it's only when it comes to Israel that the international community thinks that the results of war are always reversible. In other places, when you start a war and you lose territory, too bad, you've lost it. And that's how it stays. In the case of Israel, everybody always thinks that the Palestinians should get back something that, by the way, they never had. We were the first to grant them a semi-state in Judea and Samaria, and a full state in Gaza, by the way. The Gaza Strip was the pilot of the idea of a Palestinian state. And we know what came of that. They took all the money from international aid, and instead of investing it in what I remember writing these things. This would be proof of the possibility of coexistence. This would be the Singapore of the Middle East. And they took all that money to build terror tunnels and train terrorists and teach their children that Jews do not deserve to live. So the pilot failed. And I hope that we will never make this mistake again and believe that those Nazi jihadists of Hamas can be our nice neighbors at any point, and no more than we would agree to live by, in Nazi Germany and just assume that we would be good neighbors.
There's a term called the Nakba, which was as a result of the War of Independence, when, as it is known under the Nakba, Israel chased out the Palestinians, committed acts of atrocity, and I think it's generally accepted as a narrative. The counter narrative, and people will take your answer to this for what it's worth based on their perceptions of your biases. Is there an argument that the Nakba was actually the Palestinians fleeing in anticipation of the invading Arab armies slaughtering all of the Israelis or the Jews and not slaughtering their brethren or their Palestinian brothers? So that's why the Palestinians fled the land that they subsequently lost after losing that war.
Yeah. So first, I personally resent the term Nakba. The term Nakba in Arabic is disaster. Disaster implies that, there was an earthquake and then they lost their land. No, they lost their land because they waged a genocidal war against the Jews. There was an attempt to show that Zionism was actually a preconceived plan to ethnically cleanse the land of Israel from Arabs. Benny Morris, the very talented historian, attempted to prove that hypothesis in a masterly book, which I recommend to everyone to read, called The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, 1947-1949. And in the concluding chapter of that book, Benny Morris, who was very critical of Zionism, had to confess that the Palestinian refugee problem was a result of a war, not of any preconceived plan. Now, What does that mean, a result of the war? It's a mixed bag. Part of this exodus was Arab leaders calling the Palestinians to evacuate until the Arab armies redeemed their land. Parts were the result of actual combat activity in places where these people lived, and part was the result of escalation, and some were also expulsions. Most famously, the case of Ramle and Lud after the first break in the war, after the summer of 48, when Israel overtook. I'm giving you this as one example because it's the example of expulsion, and that was the city of Ramle and Lud. The cities were occupied, and there was a curfew, and then apparently, because of a mistake in navigation, a unit of the Jordanian army came into Lud, and the Arabs thought that the Arab armies are coming to redeem them, and they en masse left their homes with their weapons and started attacking the very few soldiers that were there. The curfew was harshly enforced. 200 people, citizens of Ramle and Lod, lay dead in the streets at the end of that battle, and everyone was shell-shocked. And this episode ended with Yitzhak Rabin, the great peacemaker, who was the chief of operations for that area in the war, signing a telegram saying, expel all population to the east without any, to be executed immediately. And so a few tens of thousands began an exodus, others stayed, but this shows you when there were expulsions, how they happened. Now, was a decision of the heads of state involved? That's an interesting question. Historians apparently can't solve them, because the only record that we have is one testimony of an interested party in a meeting of three: Yigal Allon, one of the commanders of the army, Yitzhak Rabin, and Ben Gurion. And when Yigal Allon asked Ben Gurion, what are we going to do with the population now? We have our troops stuck in the middle of this city, and it's volatile. And according to that version, Ben Gurion did this motion with his hand. If people are listening to us on audio, he did a motion saying that looks like sweep them out. And that's the only record that we have of that episode. So it goes to show what happened. But remember that at this time, whole populations were expelled wholesale from territories that they lost. Just take Germany. Millions of Germans were transferred, just thrown away from their homes and kicked out. And Germany itself, in fact, was moved to the west to make room for more Poland. So that was a thing that happened everywhere after World War II. Jews apparently were more careful than other peoples in making transfer of populations their preferred mode of solving demographic problems.
Now, we don't have the time to get into all of the wars. There are, I'd say, 6 typically reference big wars. You have the War of Independence, 48, Yom Kippur War, 67.
No, 67 is the 6 Days War.
6 Days War, sorry.
There was a war that Israel initiated, the Suez War, in 1956. And I compare the current war to this war because in 56 we realized that Gamal Abdel Nasser, the president dictator of Egypt, was forming a noose around the state of Israel. And 1 year prior to the war, he concluded a deal with the Soviets, which upgraded his army immensely. And so here is a leader of the largest Arab country with an explicit plan to unite all Arabs under the pan-Arabic ideology into one state around Israel, and then to suffocate it and throw the Jews to the sea. These are his terms. And so in 1956, along with the Brits and the French, which were worried about the nationalization of the Suez Canal by the same Nasser, there was a conspiracy between the three of us to beat Nasser back. and Israel jumped at the opportunity to send, I wouldn't say to an age before, but to set back the Egyptian army at least a few years.
Okay, I mean, we're going to get. I think people are going to say, Vivi, ask some questions about the atrocities that Israel has committed in times of war, etc. I do want to get to some. There are some key examples that people always reference in terms of Israel's having committed atrocities. I forget the name of the village there was a slaughter in a village that the accusation is Israel let the Lebanese army slaughter the village, and I forget the name of it now. Yeah, that's Sabah Shatila. Thank you. Yeah. So, I mean, at the risk of picking the biggest ones, I mean, what is the Israeli perspective, the Israeli side of the Sabra and Shatila massacre, which is, that along with USS Liberty are the prime examples that everybody goes to criticize Israel or accuse them of being worse than.
Well, Arabs killed Arabs in the Sabra and Shatila. The IDF was not directly involved in the slaughter. The actual argument is that we should have seen it coming, and we should have understood that if you left the warring factions of the endless Lebanese civil war to just do justice by themselves, then they would deal with each other as Arabs deal with Arabs. Muslims deal with Muslims. Muslims killed about 10 million Muslims in the 20th century. How many Arabs did Israel kill in the whole of the 20th century? About the number of casualties that the United States had in the Vietnam War. So about 60,000 in a number of wars waged to wipe us off the face of the earth. So when people say that Israel commits atrocities, this is, I don't want to say that everything is anti-Semitic, but this is certainly a double standard. If you look at what we did in Gaza now, the ratio of civilians to combatant deaths is between 1.5 to 3. What the UN calls the average in such wars is between 7 and 10 civilians for every combatant killed. And this is in the densest place on earth, where Hamas is cynically putting its own women and children in the line of fire as human shields. Just to compare, when the United States flattened Raqqa or Mosul from the air, they killed about 9 civilians for every combatant. That is more than 3 times the ratio of Israel, and yet we are blamed for atrocities. So,
well, I mean, the retort to that is
standards.
Well, I definitely agree on the double standard. The only retort to that is going to be a lot of people consider what was done in Iraq, Afghanistan, Yugoslavia by the West to be an atrocity as well, although it took 20 years for people to finally come around to that. I mean, I got to ask the questions about October 7 and following, and then we'll get back to some other questions.
Sure.
Israel survived won the last, the 7 big wars. Largely, I mean, what degree would be placed on the assistance of financing arming from America? Is it safe to say without the arming and aid of America, Israel would not have survived any of those wars, or certainly not all of them?
Well, maybe not all of them. Certainly not. There were wars where we did not get help from the United States. The War of Independence, there was an embargo against us in the United States. The War of 56, the French equipment, 67 French equipment. It was the 73 war where an airlift of weapons probably saved the day for the IDF. It was also the United States that stopped us from complete victory over Sadat's army. We at the end of the war we recuperated and went on the offensive, and we had the 3rd Egyptian army trapped, and that was a major lever to get concessions. But Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon intervened, and what they did was create something that would look a little bit like a tie in order to save face for Egypt, to make both sides prepared for peace. Antony Blinken tried to do the same thing with this war when he tried and failed to prevent Israeli victory. We only now know the extent to which the United States crippled our war effort by a weapons embargo. And they played a double game. They helped us on the one hand. We used a lot of American equipment, but they did not let us win, which is partly why the war dragged on for so long, because we couldn't win it without a United States lifting the embargo on some essential equipment. Things have dramatically changed for us after the Biden administration left, because the Biden administration philosophy, which was never explained to the American public properly, is the policy of appeasement towards Iran. If you listen carefully to behind their laundered terms, when they said regional integration, what they were trying to create since Obama was a new balance between the Sunnis and the Shiites by sacrificing the Israeli and the Saudi interest in the region and basically letting the Iranians have the bomb, because the JCPOA, the nuclear deal, was actually camouflage for the Iranian nuclear program. And we saw what it is now. When the minute Biden won the election, we realized that Iran has the equipment and the ability to enrich uranium to war grade percentage. And they immediately did that. If you look at the timeline, November 2020, they didn't even wait till Biden would enter the White House to begin enriching uranium to weapons grade. And so we were going to be the victims of the policy of the country, which is also our greatest ally. But the Obama administration was not honest with the American public, and it presented the nuclear deal as containment on the Cold War model, as if, as Obama said, this would block all path to the bomb. In 2018, I think he confessed that he knew, or it may have been before. It may have been before he left office. So that would be probably 14 when he said that by 2025, or don't catch my exact year, I don't remember the exact quote, they would be 2 weeks away from breaking to a bomb. So Obama knew that Iran was granted the ability to manufacture a nuclear weapon, and that's mortal danger to Israel.
Well, I mean, that's after Obama, didn't trade for the hostages, but gave or released, I don't know, what was it, $8 billion that they said were frozen assets of Iran that they had the obligation to release in the first place. I mean, to me, it was clear that Obama and Biden were trying to empower Iran, or at least appease
Absolutely.
and finance. But the question is this, and we're going to get to October 7 now. Israel is, for whatever the reason, among the most sophisticated, if not the most sophisticated military on earth. They're living next to, literally, what they know are mortal enemies, declared existential enemies. There is an argument, Scott Horton brought this up when we were discussing it, and people have, I don't believe it's contradicted, but that, is it in fact the case that Netanyahu, operating on the basis that there can never be a two-state solution, such that there should then never be coalition between the West Bank and Gaza, was using Hamas to play against the PLO, and thus financing or allowing the financing of Hamas, whom he knows to be the existential threat to Israel, so as to create division among the Palestinians.
Uh-huh.
Is that true? And then, to the extent that it is or is not, how the hell do you live next to an existential threat and then not have the most sophisticated
That's
army?
a very good question, and it's a complicated one. The first thing you have to know is that it was not up to us. Once the decision to leave Gaza, which Netanyahu was against, he voted with the coalition as long as he was the minister of the Treasury and wanted to get his reform through. But before the final vote on the disengagement from Gaza, in protest, he resigned from the cabinet. He was against this. And he said this would turn into a Hamastan. There would be a monster on our border. But the decision was taken on a very thin margin of a majority in the Knesset, in our parliament. And once the decision was taken, the Bush administration forced Israel to allow Hamas to compete in the election. And then Hamas won the elections. And after it won the elections, it overtook Gaza, and then it killed all the Fatah operatives, and now you have Hamas in power. Now, did Netanyahu thought it was a good idea to split the Palestinians in two. He also thought that Hamas harbors murderous intentions. But our whole intelligence establishment assured us that Hamas was deterred. And this was the assumption we were all banking on. And this is, part of the misunderstanding. We talk about the other endlessly, and multiculturalism and identity politics, but we don't actually respect differences. In the end, we think that everybody is like us. And so in the end, as Obama said, everyone wants to put food on the table, have a safe environment for their children, and come back home from work to a well-warmed home with a roof over their head. Not so. These are serious religious believers. They are really fanatical about their beliefs. And they really think that dying for the holy cause of killing Jews justifies sending your children to die. And this is what they did. We did not fathom that they are capable of such extreme savagery. And we thought by a combination of carrots and sticks, we can control these things. We'll let their standard of living rise. We'll give them employment in Israel, excuse me, and once in a while, we'll give them a slap on the back of the hand. And that will suffice. And they were far more sophisticated than we were. And in this case, Netanyahu was part of this conception, but he was relying on a whole military establishment that was completely fooled by Yahya Sinwar in multiple levels. But Yahya Sinwar understood that we think that he will not gamble on the rising standard of living. And this is the information that he diligently fed us until the crucial day of the Al-Aqsa flood, as they call it.
So I'm not as old as you, but I haven't lived as long as you have. But I've lived through Intifada number 1, Intifada number 2, the spate of suicide bombings, the Fogel massacre. The idea that maybe Netanyahu and the government thought that they had pacified through carrots and sticks Hamas is one thing. And people have called me too critical because I wasn't there, and I have not been, to quote Douglas Murray. To me, it's inconceivable that October 7th could have happened on the scale that it did for the duration that it did. Is it in fact the case that these Hamas terrorists were roaming towns for 12 hours before there was a military response from the state of Israel?
We still don't know.
Sorry, man, I've got something. How on earth is there not been answers about how it occurred before the response had been determined by the very people who were at the helm when this occurred?
Well, first, because our press, along with the rest of the elite, is obsessed with removing Netanyahu. Think about the Trump derangement syndrome. It's the same. So they have not been inquiring into what really happened. They have been searching for a way to pin this thing on Netanyahu and then to have him removed, which is very difficult because the person who is to blame more than any other, the head of Shin Bet, Ronen Bar, who is now refusing to leave his post, even though he was fired by the cabinet. We have a rogue head of the Secret Service. Imagine, I don't know, James Comey just refusing to leave his seat after Trump fired him. So it was Ronen Bar, who the head of the Shin Bet, the Secret Service, who was in charge of intelligence in Gaza. And he also took the crucial decisions that night, one of which was not to wake Netanyahu up and inform him of what was happening. Now, Ronen Bar is deep inside the mentality of the radical left in Israel. He's obsessed with the right. He's obsessed with infiltrating right-wing settlers organizations, but he did not do his job as head of the Shin Bet, when the left was not just burning our streets, but also advocating mass desertion of reserve duty in the army. So he did not do his job. Now, try to get into this frame of mind, and you'll see what happened that night as we are now able to begin to piece together the puzzle. There were growing signs of an impending Hamas attack, but in Ronen Bar's mind, the Oslo peace process mind, the Israeli right is the evil party and the Palestinians are our future friends. And so his interpretation was that the growing signs of an impending disaster were in fact signs of Hamas being nervous about the possibility of an Israeli invasion. And so what he advised the army to do, and they take his advice seriously because this is his intelligence turf, what he advises is almost a command. And he said, don't wake up the soldiers, don't cancel the parties. Apparently, this is the pieces that with all likelihood are the puzzle. So we do know that he did not, the soldiers were slaughtered in their sleeps. Nobody alerted the soldier that danger was brewing. Now you ask, didn't you want to be on the safe side and just whisper to the soldiers something may possibly happen? No, the philosophy, according to a Shin Bet former operative that I interviewed on my podcast, who is privy to the actual information, he said the idea was not to get dragged into accidental escalation. So if you alert the soldiers around the Gaza perimeter, then you will confirm the Palestinian fear of an impending attack. So we have to be quiet, basically show our jugular in order to convince the enemy that we harbor no ill. And this is how they didn't even evacuate the party at Nova. This guy had all the intelligence before him, the basic things, SIM cards, all these thousands of terrorists had Israeli cell phones because there's no reception in Israel for the Palestinian cell phones. And so in the middle of the night, or before that, in the evening, Israeli SIM cards are beginning to light up on the Palestinian side of the fence. And instead of seeing that as a sign of an impending attack, why would they need Israeli SIMs? This guy who believes in the two-state solution and in the Oslo framework just thought they were worried about an Israeli attack. And so let's calm them down.
This isn't, I mean, I say this is insanity because, I mean, we can operate on we can all at least admit it was the most catastrophic security failure in Israeli history. We can agree
Absolutely.
on that. There are people out there, and, I've not entertained it, but it's not an irrational theory that, whether or not they knew it was going to be as extensive as it was, it could serve as a good pretext for a Netanyahu who wants to expand a buffer zone or expand Israel into the Gaza Strip. So have a horrible terror attack, and then the retaliation will be exactly what we're seeing now, leveling entire areas of land that are never going to be given back or taken back by Palestinians. Flip side,
if anyone in the world thinks that Netanyahu would have families tied together in barbed wire, then have gasoline spilled on their heads and then lit up in order to achieve whatever it was that he wanted to achieve in Gaza, that person must be crazy and completely unfamiliar with the way of thinking of Netanyahu. Netanyahu is a very soft-hearted person. And this is why my strongest critique of him is how much he's willing to give up for hostages. Because we are teaching our enemies that there is nothing more profitable than taking Jewish hostages. I criticize that since the Shalit deal. That is also Netanyahu. So to think that this man would allow savagery in order to reoccupy Gaza is a complete fantasy.
Well, and then a flip side, if people are in fact as deranged about Netanyahu as some Americans are about Trump, you could have the theory that they would allow a deliberate lapse in security to then place the blame on Netanyahu to oust him from power, which is another
conspiracy theory.
Sure.
That one is popular on my side of the aisle, and I resist that one too. I don't think even the anti-Netanyahu deranged crowds, some of which are encouraging a future political murderer, assassin, I don't think that any of them would actually sacrifice women, children, the elderly to one of the most barbaric, sadistic, unbelievably deranged attack on human beings in recent history. Most people and I can't blame them, shut their mind from seeing what was happened there. They can't believe that anyone would seat parents in front of their children and then dismember the children alive in front of their parents with relish, film this on GoPro, and send this to their own families, as well as the families of the victims, in order to brag. So these are not theoretical Nazis. These are possibly worse than the Nazis, in the sense that the Nazis were cold and calculated and never wanted their hands dirty. These people want to wallow in blood. They want to rape a 12-year-old girl to death by gang rape. These are the people we are living here with, or we are neighbors to. And let me tell you, the Palestinian Authority cheered the massacre. 70 to 80% of the Palestinian population in Judea and Samaria were for the Hamas massacre. We're happy with the Hamas massacre. So we have to live with these people. I am very critical of people like Ronen Bar and the wild anti-Netanyahu deranged left, which is undermining Israel's war effort now, and also made it harder to get the abductees back, because if you shout now, then you're obviously raising the price and making it more difficult to have the hostages back. So as much as I have a stomach full on these people, I don't think any of them were cynical enough to let these animals slaughter and burn children in order to achieve the political removal of Netanyahu. They are not willing to lose the war for that, but that's another issue entirely.
Well, that comes back then to, it's just a catastrophic series of errors, catastrophic neglect. Why did it? I mean, how did it take upwards of 12 hours before military in a country that's 6 hours across? How did it take them 12 hours to get into these villages to fight off the terrorists?
I have absolutely no answer. The only thing I can say about this is, why haven't we been asking the former chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, to provide answers? And the reason is that Herzi Halevi was undermining Netanyahu, and anyone who undermines Netanyahu is sanctified in the press, because it becomes taboo to criticize them. And so to this moment, we do not understand what has happened. Everybody is asking this question. The press is not.
Okay, and now, to a cynic like me, what's the answer to, if you don't understand how the most catastrophic failure in Israeli intelligence occurred, how the hell can you have those same people then determine the proper response and carry it out effectively without making matters worse?
Well, that, I'm afraid I have no good answer to that too. These people grew up on a progressive diet of idiotic ideas about war. They were not educated to win decisive victory, but rather to contain the enemy, to understand the enemy, to have a political horizon to the battle and all this other claptrap. Most of them were educated in American universities, unfortunately, and these are not the old lines of battle or the young lines of battle that we now see in the IDF. These are all peaceniks, peace processors. They kept telling themselves that Hamas was deterred, and they were not ready for it. And also, they outsmarted us in yet another way. There was a brilliant article by my colleague from my English language podcast with Mike Duran, Tablet's Israel Update. He wrote an article with John Kasapoulou, the military analyst. And they said this was Star Wars against Mad Max. We were getting ready for Star Wars, and they gave us Mad Max. And so they fooled us with low tech. And I'll just give you one example. Yehia Sinwar was one step ahead of us. He knew that our sophisticated cyber units can penetrate his cell phone. So on his cell phone, he only said what we wanted to hear. When he gave orders for marching, it was with a pencil and a piece of paper. And this is how low-tech defeated high-tech. We had a brilliant slurry wall. We have excellent cyber security. We have a great Air Force, and we have great commando units. And nobody expected a bulldozer and Toyota trucks to breach the fence, which they did very, very smartly, by the way, by gradually eroding our vigilance. Because if you remember, in 2018, there were the marches of return in which crowds were rushing to the fence, and Israel didn't know what to do. So gradually, we accustomed ourselves to the idea that they can get closer to the fence, and then they breached it.
Human intelligence. I mean, I've heard the argument about the low tech beat the high tech, but when you then, in the context of the war, result in a situation where Israel has somehow planted incendiary devices in pagers and gotten them to each of the Hamas leaders, you have a human intelligence element.
That was Hezbollah.
Sorry about that. Just to illustrate the level of technology and human intelligence, how is there no human intelligence predating this October 7th attack?
Yeah, because this is the same. They were drunk on technology. They believed, along with many in the West, by the way, that technological advantage is itself enough of a deterrent. And this is how they fooled us. And Shabak, Shin Bet, Shin Bet is like the FBI. It should operate within Israel. But since Israel controlled Gaza for a long time, Shin Bet was in charge of Gaza. But the new generation of Shin Bet people relied less on human sources and more on technology. The Mossad, they operate completely differently. And while the Shin Bet was unable to detect 2,500 terrorists breaching the fence,
or planning the breach,
it seems like even after they breached, it seemed like Mossad could pinpoint the hair in Nasrallah's nostrils, and they were amazing. I can speak freely because I have absolutely no information about how they did this. We have rumors, we have what was published in the press, but that was absolutely amazing. And when I interviewed Netanyahu and he explained how he took this decision, there were different opinions within the cabinet. He said this is not just an effective targeting of the actual terrorists. It is also, he said, shock and awe. You do this to an organization and they become completely paranoid. After you do this, the Hezbollah people, I'm sure, were afraid to press their electric kettle. You make your enemy paranoid, and then we managed to dismantle the major forces of Hezbollah, and then, in Syria too. After the fall of Assad, we basically wiped out the equipment of the Syrian army. And so I think what Netanyahu deserves the most credit for is that he took us from the lowest low into a place much higher than we were before October 7th. Before October 7th, Iran was tying a noose around us. And I personally thought it would take 10 years of war. I said this at the beginning of the war. I said, we have a decade of wars before we can get to Iran. And Netanyahu managed to keep this war alive despite American pressure and carry it from Gaza to Lebanon to Syria and all the way to the outskirts of Tehran. And so we completely changed. The whole Obama plan of restructuring the Middle East was foiled by one man, Benjamin Netanyahu. That's his name. Because even within his cabinet, people were pressuring to stop the war. And he managed, despite wild demonstrations in the street, despite the terrible situation with the hostages, despite immense American pressure, despite a complete cold shoulder from the international community, despite The Hague, despite the Israeli media, which was also demanding surrender. Despite all this, he carried the war until we completely transformed the strategic situation of Israel in the Middle East. And I believe that when history books are written, this achievement would be considered on the magnitude of, I'd say, perhaps the 10 most important summits of 3,500 years of Jewish history, no less than that.
Now, I know you've got a heart out, and I just want to maybe get two more questions in if I can.
Yeah.
I've been alive not as long as others, but long enough to know to know who your neighbors are. And I've been a proponent of the two-state solution. I'm told I'm a naive buffoon for even thinking it's possible. And what about the theory that if you can't have a consensual two-state solution, you have an involuntary two-state solution? Just seal up the border, build a big wall, and allow no back and forth, and protect yourselves at all costs, and then let the neighboring Arab nations decide what to bring in or what not to their Palestinian brethren. Why not have a compelled two-state solution if you can't have a consensual one based on mutual recognition of existence?
I thought exactly that. I thought exactly like you in the Gaza disengagement. This is exactly what we tried: a fence, and disengagement from them. And we got Hamas, and we got this invasion. And so the only way to prevent another October 7 is to have an IDF presence on the other side. There is no other way. So for the disappointing news is that the foreseeable future, I think Israel needs to occupy Gaza until it manages to do something like the denazification of Germany after the World War II. But the Nazis only ruled for 12 years, and these people with their Muslim Brotherhood theology have been bringing up generations and generations in this anti-Semitic deranged cult of death. And I don't think that would be an easy task. So a forced two-state solution is not in the cards.
The other question is, we don't know what numbers to trust. You're on the Israeli side of things. What is the casualty total versus the casualty? What is the civilian casualty versus casualties at large in Gaza? And what numbers do you trust?
We don't have. We only have Hamas numbers, and we know not to trust these. I'll just say again that we have done everything possible to minimize civilian casualties, and they have been doing everything possible to maximize civilian casualties because they don't care about the deaths of their own children if they can use them as a weapon against Israel. And now it is a disgrace that the international community is blaming Israel for civilian death when we are faced with an army using human shields. If anyone thinks that Israel would give up its right to protect itself because Palestinians are putting their own children to protect their rockets, they're mistaken, because that would be national suicide and personal suicide to all Jews living in the state of Israel. So one thing we should teach the Palestinians in this war is that by making your own civilians human shields, you will not save yourselves. What we should do, we should not slaughter whoever we can prevent from dying in this war. But we should start taking territories, creating evacuation corridors for humanitarian evacuation, and then anyone staying in that rubric of territory is a combatant and is under siege until they surrender, and go all through the Gaza Strip like that, and then see, many Gazans we know now want to evacuate Gaza and relocate somewhere else. Israel does not support forced relocation, but let's start with voluntary relocations because there are many buyers for that plan. Not many people want to keep living in a Hamas scorched territory.
And then last question, I know the answer, maybe a lot of people don't. Other than the answer that because they don't have to, why don't the neighboring Arab countries take in the Palestinian refugees, which they, full disclosure, I believe that the neighboring countries use the Palestinian plight as a cudgel against Israel. But for those who may or may not trust your answer, why wouldn't, other than because we don't have to, why wouldn't the neighboring Arab countries take in the Palestinian refugees?
I completely agree with your analysis. First, because they're still desirous of using the refugee problem as a means to undermine Israel. And secondly, and this is not a very nice answer, the Palestinians' experience taught have been a subversive element wherever they settled. King Hussein of Jordan suffered that in the 70s. And what he did is just bomb their refugee camps, after they began to act as a state within a state. Then they evacuated to Lebanon, where they undermined the Lebanese government by creating a state within a state. And then we, with the United States, expelled them to Tunisia, where they did not have the forces to do that. So people are generally not easily convinced to take in large Palestinian populations.
Gaddy, this was fantastic. If we can do a part 2 later after the internal investigation shows how and what happened on October 7, it's been fantastic. Where can people find you who are watching on my end?
We have Mike Duran from the Hudson Institute and I have a podcast called Israel Update. I think my suggested slogan, Mike doesn't like it, he thinks it's too banal, is we cut through the media bias. There is a lot of BS about Israel and politics. It's a balanced show. I'm an Israeli. Mike is a foreign policy analyst at the Hudson Institute. We are both on the conservative side, true, but we correct a bit of the terrible media bias to the liberal side. So I heartily recommend our podcast, Israel Update, available on YouTube and also on the Tablet Magazine website on audio.
Amazing. I'll put the link up in the pinned comment. Gaddy, thank you very much. And everybody out there, I hope you enjoyed.
It was a
Peace
pleasure.
out, everyone.